Our featured BBBGive.org accredited charity seal holders for this episode are Pediatric Brain Tumor Foundation, SOAR 365, USA for UNHCR. To find out more about these and other BBB Wise Giving Alliance accredited charity seal holders, go to give.org.
You're listening to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor, powered by BBBGive.org. Here we explore the motivations that form the basis of giving and service. We inspire generosity and celebrate the transformative effects that giving and service have on the human spirit and on community. The conversations featured on the podcast also uncover giving strategies that educate and provide tools to help listeners make impactful gifts of both their time and money. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Welcome to the Heart of Giving podcast, powered by BBBGive.org. Give.org is the nation's standards-based charity evaluator, and we're your one-stop source for information on giving and reports on the most asked about charities. I'm Art Taylor. You know, on this show, we uncover many different ways of giving back, contributing to society, and growing humanity so that we can all move forward in a positive direction. And one area that has been hopefully beginning to get better addressed in our country, although we still have miles and miles to go before we sleep, is the whole issue of racism, and dealing with some of the fundamental root causes of racism in our society. And once we understand that, of course, we want to begin to try to address those root causes so that we can get past this horrible scourge that has continued to harm us as a country, continue to hurt our people, and it's continued to hold us back, really, in ways that can almost be ways that frankly can be quantified economically and certainly socially. The fact that Black people in this country who helped build this nation through their free labor as slaves, never were compensated for that effort, were never given a choice to contribute that labor and effort to the building of this country. The fact that nothing has really ever been done to essentially repay them for that contribution. And in fact, we still see remnants of how their lack of payment for that labor affects them in our society today. We get to the question of how might we as a nation address that? We even get to the question of how can we heal as a society unless we address it? I'll just give you one quick example. There are still communities in this country that were subjected to what's known as redlining. Redlining. That is, if you were African American, this is where you were sent to live. You couldn't live outside of those redlined districts. And in fact, it was even hard to get mortgages and ways to finance your construction of your home or to actually get a mortgage to live in an existing home. You were redlined because you were Black. You were going to be in a neighborhood that was going to be devalued economically. This still exists today. I can tell you personally, I live in an area that is redlined. We have a beautiful home in Prince George's County that if it were situated anywhere outside of this majority Black-owned county would be worth 40 to 50% more than it currently is worth. That is simply a function of racism in our society. We've lost millions of dollars. We've lost trillions of dollars as a race because of redlining. When you think about how Black people and how people in this country can move forward economically, it's usually because of home ownership. But if we're not being compensated for our homes, if our homes aren't valued the same as other homes, we can't get the same value out of those homes. Just one small example of how racism has affected us economically. So there are people, fortunately, in this country who have the privilege, and I won't say privilege in a way that is used in this life. I'll say privilege from the standpoint, I'm glad they're doing it, of thinking about how we can actually level that playing field, how we can actually repay or make people who've been subject to this racism and this economic degradation whole again. And I am really fortunate today to have a couple of people on the show with me who are working that issue. The organization that they are representing is a group called Liberation Ventures. And I want to just say to their leader, Aria, Florant, who's with us today, how pleased I am that you're working this issue. And I'm just going to tell you just a little bit about Aria. She was born in Colorado, and she'll tell you more about her background. But imagine being born in a community where you are of mixed race and you are thinking through this whole matter of who am I as a person? You know, am I Black? Am I white? I feel like I'm both because I have parents that are both. But knowing that something isn't quite right, something is off about how you're being treated, how you're perceived in society, and then growing into adulthood, wanting to figure out what that is and how to address it. We're going to talk to Aria about that and how that led her to this business, this charity work of addressing these inequalities, these economic inequalities. And with her is Tonyel Edwards, who is also a person who graduated from Howard University, went to work in a major bank, and then felt that she needed to do more to contribute to society. And somehow these two connected. And here they are working together. And we'll let you just tell us how you're working together on this. But here they are, these two wonderful women working on this issue to try to help us all understand, first of all, what reparations might look like if we were to do it. And then how we might achieve it and what's being done right now to get us there. So ladies, welcome to the Heart of Giving podcast. Sorry for that extra long introduction, but we're going to spend as much time as you need to get this story out and get this work out that you're doing. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Art. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
You gave us such great introductions. I appreciate that. I'll quickly share how Aria and I connected and then toss it over to Aria to get us going around the amazing work that Liberation Ventures has been doing. So I had an opportunity.
And this is Tonyel, by the way, everybody.
This is Tonyel. Hello, everybody. I joined Tonyel Edwards Partner at Bridgespan, and joined Bridgespan about a year and a half ago, following spending some time in philanthropy and at a foundation, private foundation in Houston. And when as a Black woman, so lived experience as a Black woman in America, in the South, two hardworking parents who have positioned me incredibly well in life, while also at the same time interacting with every single barrier that one could imagine and all of the systemic injustices that exist in our world. And when I joined Bridgespan, made the intentional decision I wanted all of my work to be focused on what does it take to actually close the gaps. I'm tired of talking about gaps. I'm tired of talking about the inequities, the injustices. What do we do? And in having a meeting with Aria was one of my first meetings at Bridgespan, and she shared the work that Liberation Ventures was doing around reparations and racial repair. And I was both incredibly moved, but it was also so practical. So it's like, okay, this is the missing conversation. And the hypothesis coming out of the conversation with Aria is like there have to be more foundations, private foundations, folks with resources thinking about this issue and investing. But these stories aren't being told in the way that they should. They're not being lifted up, not being aggregated and shared as like this is a viable strategy to actually close the gaps that exist in our country. And so Aria and I teamed up to Liberation Ventures and Bridgespan, made the decision to work together to co-author a report to understand what exactly is the role of philanthropy in reparations. And this led to the articles that are on both bridgespan.org and SSIR right now around the role of philanthropy in reparations. So I will let Aria talk more about kind of the origin story of Liberation Ventures and how she decided to choose to work with us because she could have worked with anyone. She's brilliant.
Thanks, Tonyel. And thank you, Art, for that introduction. And it's so interesting, as you mentioned, growing up in Colorado, I always identified as Black. My dad, we were in a circumstance where my parents just thought it was incredibly important to make sure that the message was always, you got to be twice as good. You got to dot all your I's, cross all your T's. And so I was very aware of being different from a young age, and still had a lot of questions about what it meant to be biracial. And my mom is white. And I think like broadly what that looks like is identifying sort of like, what does it mean for me to have an identity that holds both oppressors and the oppressed? And I think that duality, now I know that duality is not just me, it's our nation, right? It's the story of our nation. And so the questions that I was holding became sort of like, what does it mean? What would it mean for our nation to really become whole? And so Liberation Ventures, our North Star is to see federal comprehensive reparations policy for Black Americans. And the way that we think about reparations is actually different from, I think, what a lot of people sort of immediately assume it to be. Most people think reparations equals cash for Black people. And we have a much more expansive perspective on what reparations really is and what its function truly is, which is repair. And so there is a financial component to reparations, and it is also non-financial. It is also about systemic change. And I think in that vein, we really see it as kind of a step along the path to truly building a just multiracial democracy. Any country that has difference is going to have breakdown. And that breakdown or that conflict is actually not the problem. The problem is when you are not able to repair it. And so the way we think about it is this country is only as strong as our ability to repair. And so a lot of the way that we think about our work is not only about policy change, but about culture change and about building a culture of repair. And in that realm, in that vein, we really believe that reparations is not just an economic project, it's a political and a cultural project, and it benefits all of us. Black folks are at the center, but it really benefits all of us. We exist to support the amazing movement of organizations and people across the country doing work in this space. We support them with grant making and narrative change and capacity building. And it is, as you said in the beginning, it is a privilege to do that work, to be in a space of really deeply thinking about what do I want this world to look like? How do I want it to look different 20 years from now? And what am I doing now to actually put those seeds in the ground and water them so that in 20 years, things look different from the way they are now.
Amazing. I want to come back to that. But first, I want to just ask you both, how did you come to this? I mean, both of you, I know a little bit about your backgrounds, have amazingly powerful degrees from very prestigious universities. You could have done all sorts of things that would have enriched you, and maybe you have already. But how did you then decide, you know what? I think I want to spend time doing this. This is kind of where I believe I should be spending my time right now. How did you come to that? And I want to ask you that because there are others out there who are probably toiling away at things and wondering if they can make that leap to do something that they're more passionate about. And I want to just chase that passion that led you both to this work today. So, Aria, why don't you start?
Yeah. So I come to this, I think, through a few different paths that have converged. The first path was certainly the experience of growing up in Colorado, hearing people say things about me and about my family that I knew were problematic, but not, as a child, not having the language and the context that I needed in order to push back, in order to articulate what was problematic. So when I went to college, I studied comparative studies in race and ethnicity. I like to say I was a critical race theory major before it was cool. And that was really a healing journey for me, both really understanding what it meant to have my identity, but also how then I'm positioned within a system and a history, a legacy that starts with chattel slavery and essentially has seen racial injustice permutate across different institutions in different ways since. And I really think about this work as a question of like, what does it mean to actually process through the shame of our origin in order to get to a place that is reparative and that is whole? And so I'd say that's one strand. And then part of my professional background includes working at kind of a big management consulting firm, which loves to pride itself on solving problems and therefore thinking about solutions that are at the scale of the problem. And during my time there, I really started to think about how, like, what would it look like to develop and design a much more deep root cause level intervention on racial injustice, and to design that intervention that's actually at the scale of the problem, at the scale of the wealth gap, and at the scale of the injustice across systems. And so myself and a co-founder started thinking about this, and over time really landed on wealth disparity and anti-Black narratives as sort of these two really strong anchors that end up holding our unjust systems in place, and really landed on reparations as something that actually could sort of shock the system on those two things and have a ripple effect of positive outcomes across systems. And so we started working almost 5 years ago, and I've been full-time for about 3.5 years.
So, Aria, I wanted to ask you a little more about anti-Black narratives and beginning to address that as one of the pillars of your work right now. Why do you feel that, I mean, it's kind of obvious, but I wanted to maybe know how you came to that as one of the most effective ways of healing?
Yeah. I think fundamentally the answer goes back to the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves, as well as about this country, are really, really powerful. And they determine so much about how we make sense of the world and make meaning of what happens and why it happens. I also believe that narrative change is critical for making policy change durable. So we've seen many policy wins, but we've also seen them get gutted over time because the underlying mindsets and worldviews that drove those policies in the first place weren't changed. And we've seen across time the way that a narrative of racial hierarchy has impeded sort of our psyches as Americans. You know, I can name specific narratives at different points in time. Obviously, there was a long history of believing that Black people were subhuman. The eugenics movement then tried to use pseudoscience to legitimate that, like the Christian like theology in addition sort of piled on to that eugenicist worldview for a long time. And that brings like moving into the more recent past, things like the welfare queen were totally untrue, but they were stories that then were used to justify certain policies that kept Black people in their positions at the bottom of that racial hierarchy. And we see that now in so many ways, sort of like undertones of implying that Black people are not competent or are lazy or are in some way subhuman. And the way this actually comes to the fore often is on the question of using the word reparations. So a lot of people think that it's such a divisive word, and they ask me like, what do you have to use that word? Like, could you actually, and I understand that it is a spicy word currently in our lexicon, but that to me is due to anti-Blackness, right? Because if you look across time and across even this country's history, like reparations is not a new concept, right? And it's not specific to Black people. Reparations is a legal international framework for thinking about how societies function together. And so that word only becomes a spicy word when you apply it to Black people, which then to me is like the perfect example of how embedded anti-Blackness is in our country. And so what I always say to folks is, if I were to choose to not use the word, I would actually be undermining my own cause, because I would be assuming that Black people are not owed the and deserving of the dignity that comes with receiving reparations.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the anti-Blackness, and I think about not only how non-Black people see us, but how we see ourselves. And I think that can be equally, if not even more damaging to our progress when we believe those narratives and we mistake things like getting along, for instance, or assimilating. We mistake assimilating with being lesser than who we are, not being able to show up as who we are. And I worry more sometimes about our ability to see ourselves differently, frankly, than I do sometimes about how the people who are not Black think of us. And we don't talk about this a lot outside of our own community. And I'm often reluctant to bring it up now because many of the things that we see negative in many of our communities are still driven by those external factors. But because we've taken them on, they manifest themselves in very damaging ways, right? I mean, some of the violence that we see towards each other, some of the crime that we see towards each other, some of the hatred that we project on each other still has an external cause, an external root. But we've taken it on and we kind of own it, and it leads to these kinds of harmful conditions and situations. It's hard to even get sometimes for us to even support each other in things. And I know that wasn't natural. That's not natural. It's not natural for people who are like, generally support each other. That's usually a natural thing, right? It's not generally a natural thing. So I don't know. I just worry about that too. And I may be getting out of my knowledge base here, but I'm just talk about some lived experience here. Tonyel, go ahead.
That's by design. I mean,
yep.
trillions of dollars have been poured into the narratives and the policies and the processes to get us there. And so that's exactly what we're trying to, with this particular work, trying to undo. And that was a place where Aria and I aligned strongly as a value of our work together, that we'd say the word, because it was so easy to be like, well, should we just water it? Should we just, just start here and then maybe move to that? Like, no, I mean, slaveholders got reparations. So, like that
Yep.
reparations is a thing. It's been happening in our country. And what does it look like for us to truly think about the people who are on the ground, the dozens of organizations who are doing this work, developing strategy, thinking about what it looks like? What does it look like for them to be resourced? And
Yeah.
that's the approach that's the reason Bridgespan got involved. The work was already underway. It's been happening for a long time, since before emancipation. And so our thinking was, we recognize that as a social impact advisory, we have access to both philanthropy and nonprofits. And so, how do we potentially get more dollars off the sidelines into this incredible and important investment to potentially get us to closing those gaps that we constantly talk about? It's almost like we're in a wash cycle. We're always talking about what's wrong, and we're not really reimagining what the future should look like and the investments that it's going to take to get us to that future that we imagine.
So one of the things you both said was there's a scale that we need to achieve to do this work. You talk about doing this work at scale. What is the extent of the challenge, and therefore the scale that we must work at in order to address it? What are we talking about?
It's a great question. And there's so many ways to answer it. I think you can answer it from a monetary perspective, looking at the scale of the racial wealth gap, which is by different figures upwards of 10 trillion. And I would think about that challenge as not just the challenge of closing that gap, but also keeping it closed. And that's actually a different but connected part of the challenge. But I think in addition, there is a massive cultural challenge that we are facing as well, as it relates to how we understand this country and what we're equipped to do in order to build a just and equitable future. And so what I mean by that is, when we started this work, we asked ourselves this kind of fundamental question, which is, what is repair? Like, that's such an abstract concept. So if we're going to actually operationalize it, we have to break it down into its component parts. And so Liberation Ventures created a framework that's reckoning, acknowledgement, accountability, and redress. And the way we think about those four things is that they need to operate in a continual cycle in order for us to build a culture of repair in this country. And we as individuals have to be equipped. We have to know how to do those things. Right now, the way that we come of age in this country, nothing really teaches us how to do this. And so my question is, how do we become a society where you can't grow up without learning about slavery and about the legacy of injustice in this country? And you can't grow up without knowing how to listen to someone and actually understand when a system is causing harm, and then be an agent of repair trying to figure out how to make that system more reparative. And so to me, those are the sort of like muscle building exercises that we need. I would always think about it as going to the gym, right? Like, when you go to the gym, you lift weights, your muscles get stronger. But if you stop, they atrophy. There's no, like, you don't just stay at the status quo. You have to keep going, even to stay, even to maintain. And that's the way that I think about what it would look like for us to actually build a culture of repair in this country.
Well, and the cost, it seems, has gone up more recently, with places like Florida and others basically saying there are certain things we don't even want to allow you to teach.
Yes.
We can't even bring it up in schools. So that just raises the cost and expands the scale for what you're trying to do. There's so many institutions that have to be infected with this
Yes.
way of thinking.
Yes. Yes. And I'll name something there, which I think is important, which is that yes, we're going to see backlash. We have always seen backlash in our movements. And the backlash is actually proof that we are winning, that we are making progress. And if you look at actually 18 to 29-year-olds, 45% of 18 to 29-year-olds support reparations versus it's around 30% for the general population, which by the way is higher than support was for marriage equality when that movement got started. But I think your point is really, really important in the sense that we reserve the word reparations for what the public sector needs to do because of the state sanctioned harm. But that does not let the social or the private sector off the hook. Like, we know that institutions are huge sort of drivers of culture in our society. And so we know that those institutions can engage in racial repair as well.
Well, that's really well said, because I'm on a board of an organization called the American Institute for Graphic Arts, AIGA. And this is a trade association for people who are graphic designers and designers of other kinds. And if you can just think about the power of images,
yes,
to shape our culture, right?
Yes.
And I've said at AIGA, we tend to focus on the profession itself, even though we have a dual mission of trying to impact society too. I've always pushed, not being a graphic artist myself, to say to them, we need to really lean into that societal piece and make sure that we're putting images out that are not harmful, images that are stressing the kinds of things that you're saying now that are about healing. Certainly, we don't want to confine people to doing things a certain way, but we want to make them aware as professionals that your images make a difference in how people are perceived in this culture. And so I think of them as just one institution, but a very powerful institution when you think about how we are drawn to images and how we take our being and who we are from those images that we see. So I just wanted to mention that, but there's so many out there. And again, I just want to encourage you to continue your work. Let me ask you this. You said also you want to begin to deal with some of the deepest root causes, and you came up with these two, economic being one, and the other more focused on culture. What are some of the things that sort of got left on the chopping block, so to speak, when you were putting your work together? What are some of the other areas that need some degree of focus but got left on the editing, table, so to speak?
It's an interesting question. I think that I would reframe the question slightly in the sense that I think where what ended up happening was we did have, in the early days, we knew that we wanted to be focused on moving large amounts of dollars into the movement. But we were thinking a lot about what is the right sort of moonshot goal to be focused on. And we landed on reparations as that moonshot goal, but there were a few others that we thought about. And they had to do with neighborhoods, they had to do with politics, they had to do with poverty. But what we realized was that sort of all of that is further downstream from this question of how do we actually repair from the origins of this country's history. Reconstruction was only 12 years. And so I don't know if I would name that they sort of got completely left off the chopping block, because I think they're still so connected to what reparations can mean. But I think we just ultimately got to the fact that if we can't actually repair harm, then we are Well, let me put it in a different way. We need to build the capacity to repair harm across issue areas if we're going to be able to actually solve these challenges at scale.
Tonyel, I wanted to ask you about how you're seeing, in other words, what kind of progress are we making? You're kind of in it, but you're also kind of an observer of it as well. What are you observing in terms of the change that is coming from this work? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so when I reflect on my engagement in nonprofits and then philanthropy, oftentimes we try to choose a single issue area that we focus on. So someone might be focused on educational equity or affordable housing or the wealth gap, or kind of name your single issue. And the reality is they're so interconnected. And so we got so used to saying that. And it's like, well, then what do? We're just trying to alleviate poverty. And then it's like, actually, let's double click on that. And so I think that we are seeing, I'd say since 2020 for sure, there's a different level of questioning that's happening. So we're no longer having to prove to people that this is an issue, that there is a gap. Like, let's prove it to you with the data that there's a gap. We all know that there are systemic injustices, systemic inequities, and those are just facts. Like, proving that, having to have a conversation about the validity of that that's not a conversation for a person who's thinking about strategy and the future of our world. And so now that we're for the most part aligned on the facts, the path forward is the next question. So philanthropy and nonprofits have tried so many different programs, direct service programs that are doing really important work, but kind of just addressing the symptoms. And finally, there's like, actually, no, let's trace, like Aria was stating, let's trace the history, let's trace how we got here. And then what is the investment of our time that we need to make to truly move us forward? Our goal is to hopefully reframe, like, this is the investment of a lifetime. If we're truly serious about getting to what truly an equitable, thriving, multiracial democracy looks like, if we actually want to get there and we're not just like saying words that make us all feel good, then how do we think about racial repair? How do we think about the role of reparations? And then what is it going to take for us to get there? And so I think that we're able to have that conversation more freely. In our report that we put out, we were able to have conversations with about 50 different funders and movement leaders, et cetera. It's scholars who've been doing this work for decades. And there's actual momentum. Things are actually picking up. The word is like, yep, okay, reparations. Now let's talk about it. What is the strategy? And so what does it look like to resource these people who actually have the strategy? So that's where we're in that space now. And that feels like a completely different conversation than having to fight to have people believe that something is the truth.
All right. So I want to follow up on that a little bit, because I've thought about this issue of diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, and idea, however you want to describe it. And what I've come to is that there may be 4 or 5 different types of people along a continuum. There are people who don't believe that there are any issues with racism in our country, and that therefore we don't really need to do anything. Just, we like the inequality that exists. If it does, let's keep it like it is. We like it. Then there are people who see that there may be racism, but basically say, we see it, but it's not a big deal. It's maybe one-off people, and you need to address those folk, and then everything will be fine. Then there are other people further along the continuum who see that there's racism, but they say it's systemic, but there's probably not much we can do about it. We're just going to have to manage it and move forward. Then there are people who see that there is racism. It is systemic. We need to do something about it, but it's going to take a long time. And there are other people who say, yeah, there is racism. There's something wrong with it. We need to do something about it right now. And you can mark people along that continuum. So my question really is this. When you focus on your work, and Tonyel, you just said a minute ago that we're not necessarily needing to have these conversations around whether there is this problem, right? People kind of see that. How many are those? I still see that there's some people on that other end of that spectrum that can't be moved. What do we do about that? Or do we need to even worry about it? Is that part of your, when we talk about getting to this place where we're no longer needing reparations, right? Let's say we're getting to this place, because I want to ask you how we define that in a minute. But when we get to that place, are we basically saying forget those folk, or we've actually brought them along? What are we talking about? Because those folk are also the same people who will do what you said, Aria, a minute ago. They're going to be constantly working behind the scenes to move things back, to swing that pendulum back in the other direction. Just curious what you think about that group of folk. Because it's easy to say, well, let's just forget them. Let's just forget them. There are enough of us who see it the right way. We're going to move forward. But they're still out there. Just look at the last presidential election. They're still out there. Look at the people who stormed the Capitol. They're still out there. So I just wanted to get your thoughts about that.
I'll give my quick kind of candid take on it. I am personally at a space where I'm so grateful for the people who are on the ground leading the charge, doing the movement work, and truly enacting the strategy, because there has to be a strategy for every segment of the population. I acknowledge that. I also think I was actually on a call with Travian Shorters right before this conversation, and he said, we need to build a different narrative. We need a better narrative. We have to talk about what we want to build, not what we want to fix. And I think that we are humans. At the core of all of us, humanity exists. And so what does it look like for us to create the world where we can all thrive? We're not operating from a space of guilt or a space of shame. There's a different world on the other side. And so just inviting folks into what that looks like has to be inspiring. It has to tap into the humanity of us all. So I'll start there, but toss it to the strategist.
No, a world of abundance where we can all rise. I love that. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I completely agree with that. My favorite question is like, what does the world look like on the other side of reparations? And I always say to people, I'm not trying to fight people to get there. I'm trying to seduce people there, because it's a joyful, amazing party that we all want to be at. So when I think about our audiences, we generally think about it as there's the folks in the choir, there's the folks in the bass, there's the persuadables, and then there's your opposition.
Yeah.
And the sort of more kind of conventional sort of movement thinking around it is like, you've got to figure out what's going to deeply activate your choir and your bass. Persuadables is sort of a misnomer in many ways, because often you're not actually trying to persuade persuadables. You are trying to just reach them and help them understand the issue and make meaning in the way that you make meaning. And then you want to repel your opposition. And some mentors of mine and advisors who have worked on big at-scale movements for change are always quick to remind me that you don't need everyone, right? And I will say that I think if we look back, like, our opposition looks very different than the opposition looked during Reconstruction, right? So I think it's not just about who do you need along that continuum, but like, where does that spectrum of people sit within a much larger continuum of like the arc bending toward justice, right? And you're sort of shifting everybody as you are trying to activate specific segments of those audiences. So that's kind of how I think about it, basically, as a both and.
Okay. So as the pendulum shifts over time, it's not shifting back as fast or as far.
Right. Exactly.
Before it goes back in the other direction, because we've moved forward as a people. And
progress has never linear. It has never been linear. And but I think that's a really important thing to remember, right? Because there's so much despair in this world. And it can feel really easy to feel like, like we didn't get this win, or this thing isn't moving as fast as we wanted it to. I'm hopeless. And that hopelessness is actually so problematic for making sure that we actually continue to make progress, right? We have to continue to have faith and to have hope that things can change in order for us to feel motivated to make them change.
So where does that come from? And this is probably going to have to be my last question for the show today. Where does your energy, your inspiration, your hope, and your vision continue to thrive? How does it continue to thrive? Given that success is not linear. You do have these setbacks. There have to be days when you wake up and say, what in the world am I doing with my life? But then you do get up and you continue with the work and you say, we're going to get through this day and we're going to go on to the next day. We're going to go on to the next day. When you're in the slog, it's a lot different than being atop the trees thinking about where you want to go. The slog is more challenging, right? How do you deal with that? Because this is not only a question for you, it's a question for many in nonprofits. Every day is not a day that is one that we're making the kind of progress we want, or we're feeling the kind of hope that we need to feel. Where does the inspiration come from?
I'd say for me, I have a 4-year-old Black son with lots of personality, and I want the world to be beautiful for him. I do not want my child at any point. I'm trying to protect him as much as I can as his mother. And so I want to be sure that he's in a school that will make him feel welcome. And he's in a space where he doesn't have additional bias, a lens placed on his, I just want him to live and be free and to thrive. And so it's both him, it's my nieces and nephews, it's the future. And that is like, literally, I'm about to cry right now as you ask that question, because somehow, for the most part, I've been able to dodge most bullets and jump most hurdles. And that's an additional burden. And so what does it look like to just be able to run in a field and love and laugh and be free? And so to know that my existence on this earth is in a teeny tiny small way potentially contributing to that potential outcome for my child and the future that comes after me means something. And I think that's what keeps me going, for sure.
Fantastic. Aria?
I just think about the fact that if we don't work on it, it's not going to happen. If we do work on it, it might happen. So we must work on it. Okay. And I think it's just kind of obvious to me. I think that I also feel, but what I will say is that, like, what drives me and what brings me joy when I work on it is deep love for my people, right? Like, for Black communities that have overcome so much, and not only just overcome so much, but done so with incredible dignity, incredible resilience, and incredible commitment to our own healing. We are a people that is trying to receive the repair that we deserve, and we are not talking about revenge. We are not talking about retaliation. We are not talking about, because we know that would actually dehumanize us, right? Because in order to dehumanize other people, you have to dehumanize yourself. So we are out here, with our souls intact and committed to keeping them intact, but also committed to the dignity that we deserve. I've been thinking about that a lot recently, and that just makes me feel so proud and honored to be kind of standing on the shoulders of so many giants who have been keeping this torch alive since before emancipation, and just down to do my part.
Well, I'm glad you're doing your part. How can others do their part? How can people join you?
Well, I think the biggest thing is there is a role for philanthropy in this work.
Okay, let's talk about it.
This movement is incredible. There are so many organizations that need to be resourced. And you don't, even foundations that don't have the capacity to figure out, like do all the sourcing, do all the diligence. That's why Liberation Ventures exists, is to be an intermediary that knows the field well, that can allocate resources. And so just really excited to talk to anybody who wants to get involved in that. And I think, I know that so many foundations and high net worth individuals often ask themselves, like, am I really having an impact? Like, is this world going to be different 20 years from now because of what I am doing now? And I would say that, like, this kind of long-term systems change is so important to be part of any investor's portfolio as it relates to making this world a better place. You can do the more short-term stuff, but you've got to do the long-term stuff so that you're not waking up 20 years from now and just still doing all the same short-term stuff.
All right. Well, wonderful. Thank you both. You've been listening to Tonyel Edwards and Aria Florant. Aria is CEO of Liberation Ventures, and Tonyel is partner at the Bridgespan Group. And what a great treat it's been for me to interview both of you. I'm so grateful that you joined the show today, and I am more grateful that you're doing this really important work on behalf of all of us. And let me just say to any of you who may be listening to the Heart of Giving podcast for the first time, we are a weekly podcast, and you can find new episodes every Tuesday. I hope you'll subscribe to the show by going to any major podcast platform. And if you want to support the podcast, that would be great too. You can make a gift by going to give.org, give.org, making a donation, and we will put it to great use. That I can assure you. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you back here next week.
You've just listened to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor. Be sure to tune in next time for a brand new episode. To listen to our other interviews, visit heartgiving.podbean.com. That's heartgiving.podbean.com. Subscribe to our show on major podcast platforms. The thoughts and opinions expressed on this podcast are the views and opinions of the guests, not those of the BBB Giving Alliance or program affiliates. This podcast is for information and educational purposes only and is copyrighted with all rights reserved. This podcast is protected by Podbean's terms of service.